Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the December Animal Care Wednesday webinar. I'm Heidi Caro with SDSU Extension in South Dakota, and we're wrapping up our year here in 2020 with a nutrition-based topic. And so a reminder as we wrap up with our Zoom webinars, everybody's probably an expert by now, but use the chat feature, please, to type your questions as you go. We'll address those at the end after the presentation. The recording will be posted to our YouTube channel, and you can find all of our archived presentations over the last few years on our YouTube channel, and I'll put that link in the post here after, or in the chat after a bit. I don't see any questions of concern in the chat, so I think I'll go ahead and start with introductions to be respectful of everybody's time. Today we're going to have Susan Schoenian, and she is with the University of Maryland Extension Sheep and Goat Specialist and on her way to retirement, unfortunately, but a big congrats to her on that life transition. We're so thankful to be able to have you today and continue to share some of your expertise in the sheep and goat world. So a little bit of background on Susan. She is the University of Maryland Extension Sheep and Goat Specialist, and she has been with the University of Maryland Extension since 1988. She holds her bachelor's and master's degree in animal science from Virginia Tech and Montana State University. Susan conducts small ruminant research at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center, and she started the 4-H Meat Goat Show at the Maryland State Fair and served as its superintendent for the first 10 years. Susan is active on social media and is the author of several websites pertaining to small ruminants. You can see those there on her first slide as well, with the Maryland Small Ruminant page, Sheep 101, and WormX, the website of the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. Susan also raises Katahdin sheep and grew up showing sheep in 4-H. And so her topic today, we challenged her with the nutritional considerations for show lambs and kids. So hopefully everybody can glean a little bit of something as we go into a new year and look for a new show year in 2021. So take it away, Susan.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and greetings everyone from the East Coast. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny day here in Maryland. I'm in the western part of the state, kind of up where it gets really thin. I'm about 80 miles from the University of Maryland at College Park. I work at a 500-acre research farm where it was mentioned that we do research there. So yes, I'm going to focus on show animals today. And what does that really mean? Does it really need to be a focus? Because I'm going to make some kind of bold statements. And one of the first things I'll tell you is I come at this topic from the perspective of an extension sheep and goat specialist, not necessarily, for lack of a better word, a show jockey or a parent who has a bunch of kids in the program. So I'm coming at it from more of the science perspective, again, as an extension sheep and goat specialist. And the first thing I'm going to say is there are no magic feeds or rations that make champions. You know, being successful showing sheep and goats, there's a lot of different moving parts. One of those moving parts is certainly science, and that's where extension focuses, you know, trying to share research-based information with our youth, with our adult clientele as well. There's certainly some art to it. We all know that. And there's certainly a lot of personal things. You could take two different kids and they have a lamb with the same genetic potential, and one's going to do really well with it and one's not. We're only going to get nutrition's only going to help us to the extent that that lamb or kid is able to reach its genetic potential. And I would argue and make this a fairly general statement: show animals have the same nutritional requirements as animals being fed for commercial markets. We're still producing a carcass at the end of the project. You could argue that show animals are almost like athletes, and you could create a nutritional program that's reflective of that. But in the end, it is still an animal that's going to end up on somebody's plate. It's still a carcass that we're producing. And because that's the case, basically the show animals have the same nutritional requirements as those that were being fed, such as these lambs that are being fed for a commercial market. It's not different. So there's a lot of feeds out there. I mean, you guys all Google and look for information and look for products. And so I just did some random Googling on some of the show feeds. They are certainly an option when these kids had these projects. And I'm certainly not going to badmouth them because they are good products. I would argue, do you really need them? Because again, when you talk about animals having certain nutritional requirements. But I'll also say a lot of these companies are very supportive of the youth program. And so they are definitely an option when we talk about feeding and raising these animals for show. But I'm not specifically going to focus on them. So this slide, lots of words on it, but just kind of a summary of the nutritional requirements of lambs and kids, basically focusing on energy and protein. Contrary to what a lot of people think, both in the commercial world and the show world, the most important nutrient is energy. It's the most limiting nutrient. It's the fuel for growth. They get energy from carbohydrates, fats, oils, and protein. How much energy a lamb needs or kid needs depends on many different factors. There are different nutritional requirements based on the genetic potential of that animal, on how big it is, how old it is, where it is in its kind of its growth pattern. Of course, our grain like corn, barley, wheat are high in energy, as are our protein supplements like soybean meal. Oats is the lowest energy grain, and it's also often included in feeding programs because it's a way to keep the intake the same, but yet lower the energy. Of course, fat is the most concentrated source of energy, about 2 times as much energy from a pound of fat as a pound of carbohydrate. You often hear a lot about fat in show diets. It's a way to get more energy in them without increasing the actual, intake of feed. Of course, hay or forage contains less energy and fat than the other feeds we're talking about, but that long stem fiber is very desirable for rumen health. Protein requirements also differ according to the things I already mentioned, the species, goats versus sheep, the breed, boar versus Spanish goat, different mature sizes of sheep. Our main source is usually soybean meal, but there certainly are other sources of protein. A lot of people think, well, if you feed more protein, you can produce more muscle in the lamb, you can keep them leaner. Years ago, there was a company called Rocco that was trying to make lamb fit the poultry model, and they were convinced that all they had to do was up the protein in the lamb's ration, and they could get them bigger and leaner. And that wasn't the case. Once you meet the requirements for these animals, they're just going to convert that protein into energy, which is costly and not necessary. So there's no reason. The only time I can ever think of exceeding protein requirements are when parasites are a big challenge. And that you can make a case for increasing protein requirements. Now, protein requirements will increase. And when I say requirements, animals need pounds or grams. They don't need percentages. But that percentage can increase if you reduce feed intake. If an animal ate a pound of feed and needed a tenth of a pound of protein, that's 10%. But if all of a sudden that you cut that intake in half, that protein percent would double to 20%. So animals require amounts, but we often talk about percentages, and those can change. So for kids that are doing projects with wethers or market animals, they need to figure out how much their animal needs to gain. And simple to determine, what does lamb or kid weigh now? How many days till your show? And then you can figure out how much it needs to gain. In my little example here, starting with a 70-pound lamb, assuming, and that's a big assumption, he's going to finish at about 140 pounds. That's 110 days, so that's 0.636 pounds per day. Lambs and kids have ideal finish weights at different amounts. Obviously, a Southdown doesn't finish as heavy as a Suffolk, and even within the Suffolk or Suffolk breeds, they have different genetic potential for growth. I've seen Suffolk lambs that are ready to butcher it at 100 pounds, and we've seen them at county fairs that are approaching 200 pounds. So there's a little bit of an art to figuring that out. You can look at the mature size of the sire and dam, and that can help you figure out what that finish weight should be. But it's a little bit of an art to doing that. Already mentioned, there's a lot of rations that are on the market for growing and finishing lambs, but the nutrient requirements keep changing. If you look there on the right, that's the nutrient requirements for a lamb. And this is for a lamb that has high growth potentials, which is typical of the lambs that we show at the county and state fairs. This is actually for maximum gain. So in the case of this lamb in this scenario, you wouldn't want to feed this much. That lamb would be gaining more than 0.6 pounds per day. One of the tough things about nutrient requirements for show animals is they really don't exist within the National Research Council. These are from 35 years ago when they actually gave the requirements for early wean lambs. So like a 2-month-old lamb, which would be pretty typical of what our kids are going to buy or raise for show. And there you can just see the bottom line gives you the protein percent. Now that protein percent is based on that top line, which is what NRC recommends how much feed that animal should get. And so you can see as the animal gets older, the protein requirements go down. Generally speaking, although not too much in this graph, usually the energy density goes down as well. But the requirements change and the percentages change, and it has a lot to do with the composition of the ration, how much roughage, how much grain, that sort of thing. And so what the kids need to do is they need to keep monitoring their lambs and kids, weigh them weekly, and also handle them. How much fat do they have on them? Because it's not weight that determines when a lamb or kid is perfect for the show. It's actually how much finish he has on them. So it's going to keep changing, and they're going to have to keep making adjustments. Okay, what about feed additives? I've got 2 of them checked off that should be in all rations for show lambs and kids, and that's a coccidiostat, which it may or may not be an ionophore. Decox, which you see down there in the lower left, it's technically not an ionophore. This would be Bovatec and Rumensin. We definitely want those in the rations. We also want ammonium chloride in the ration. That's to help prevent urinary calculi, which I'll talk about. Sodium bicarbonate, I don't think that's too bad an idea if you're feeding a really high energy diet and not much forage, and that could be free choice. The other things listed up there, with the exception of antibiotics, of course is crossed off because we can no longer feed that to lambs, and we were never able to feed that to goats. All these other things, and they're in a lot of the show feeds and show supplements, those are other things that can be added to the feed. Whether or not we need them is another story. Usually a healthy lamb or kid doesn't need these added components. Okay, next I want to go through some nutritionally related problems that we might encounter in our show lambs and goats, and commercial ones obviously as well. And some of you might think are a stretch for, are they really nutritionally? But they have a link to nutrition. First one I'll talk about is acidosis. That one's kind of obvious. It causes an increase in acidity, a lower pH in the rumen, and it's caused by the ingestion of highly fermentable carbohydrates, starch, grain, too much grain. It varies in seriousness. It can actually be at a low level and you really don't notice it, or it can be life-threatening, particularly if the lambs or kids get access to some feed they didn't have, or you have somebody feed for you while you're away and they just keep dumping feed in there, some accidental things. So it can be life-threatening. It can kill them. We need to drench them basically with something that's going to change that pH back to a healthy level. Basically, we're talking about acids, sodium bicarbonate or baking soda, milk of magnesia, things like that, mineral oil, vegetable oil, some additional, they are often treated with antibiotics as well. And certainly, if it's not an accidental exposure to feed, you need to look at what you're feeding and you may need to change it. Acidosis is not hard to prevent. We need to avoid sudden changes in their diet, especially when introducing or increasing the amount of grain in the diet. And this is pretty key when the kids first get their lambs, is that transition to their new place and to getting them on their feed. And then if you getting them up to a certain level. You always need to give the rumen time to adjust to the new diet, especially when you're going to a higher starch or higher grain diet. We need regular feeding of long fiber. So not the fiber that you see on the label of a bag of feed, but actually what they get out of eating hay. The feed additives that I already mentioned, sodium bicarbonate can help prevent acidosis, and the ionophores, while they're not labeled for that specifically, they can help with acidosis. The next disease, you're going to say, well, that's not nutritional, coccidiosis. Well, I call it nutritionally related because it affects nutrient absorption in the small intestines, and its primary symptom is scours or diarrhea. So coccidiosis is probably the parasite of much greater concern in lambs and kids than, say, the barber pole worm. Now, if the animals are going out on a pasture, that could be a different situation, but a lot of our show lambs and kids are raised in pens and they're just taken outside for exercise or maybe a teeny bit of grazing. So it shouldn't be at real high risk for worms, but definitely high risk for coccidia or coccidiosis, especially when they buy those lambs and bring them to the new farm. Again, scours is a primary symptom, but also just kind of a general ill thrift, just lambs and kids that are doing poorly. Important to understand that dewormers do not kill coccidia. In addition, the drugs that are used to treat it and prevent it are also different. There are no treatments for coccidia that are FDA approved, so you have to work with the veterinarian. Corid and sulfa antibiotics are the common treatments for coccidiosis. 5 days, not in the drinking water, but drench the animals individually. You can buy Corid over the counter, but the sulfa antibiotics, which are better, you need to get from a vet. You prevent coccidiosis with good sanitation, but even with good sanitation, there can be stresses that cause problems. So for this reason, we highly recommend that you feed a medicated feed that has a coccidiostat in it. Bovitec for lambs, Rumensin for goats, or Decox for either species. You can also treat them through the water with the Corid or sulfa antibiotics. You can do that. In the feed is probably a better option. Next disease is enterotoxemia, or what we would call classical overeating disease. We call it overeating because it tends to follow that occurrence. So all of a sudden the animals are just eating a lot more for whatever reason. Again, accidental exposure, something, they ran out of feed and then they binged when you filled it back up. It's caused by an overgrowth of bacteria, Clostridial perfringens type D, that are already in the gut, but they start to produce a lot more and they produce these deadly toxins. It's most common when lambs are on high energy, low roughage diet. Reduced gut motility is another contributing factor. So anything that slows the gut down. The treatment is the antitoxin, also penicillin. You can see a variety of treatments there. Despite all these things being done, the prognosis is often very poor. Overeating disease is pretty easy to prevent. We need to make sure the lambs and kids have been vaccinated twice for either the 3-way CDT, D being that overeating, or Covexin 8, which has several enterotoxemias in there, as well as some other diseases. If you're not sure, vaccinate them again. There is no harm in repeated vaccinations. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that it has a 3-week meat withdrawal period. You need to avoid sudden changes in the feed. I've already mentioned this, and I'm going to keep mentioning it, especially when you're adding or increasing the amount of grain in the diet. We need to feed more roughage. I'm going to keep saying that. You're going to see it's a common link to all of these diseases. Listeriosis how's this linked to nutrition? Well, it's linked to nutrition because it's primarily caused when the animals eat moldy feed, such as silage or baleage. We actually had it in a group of kid goats that we were feeding out for the county fair. Weren't sure exactly where it came from, but feed that's left in the feeder, you can get a problem with that. There are also environmental sources of listeriosis. It's caused by a bacteria. The symptoms are neurological. It can look like some other diseases. What makes it a little bit easier to diagnose is they really do go in a circle, and that's why they call it circling disease. It's treated with very high doses of antibiotics, particularly penicillin. Sometimes steroids are given to reduce the swelling around the brain. That RX means a veterinary prescription. You cannot do that yourself. Supportive care. What I mean by supportive care, fluids, nutrition, probiotics, things like that. Even when you diagnose it, the prognosis is generally poor. Don't feed moldy feed. Make sure the feed is fresh. Including the forage, not just the grain, but the forage. Keep your feeders clean. So good sanitation. Polio. Polio is another neurological disease, or in terms of symptoms. It can look like listeriosis. It's caused by a thiamine or vitamin B1 deficiency. The classic symptom is blindness or stargazing. Sometimes you'll just stand there with their heads looking up to the sky. It's most commonly associated with grain feeding and sudden changes in the diet. It can also be caused by too much sulfur in the diet. There's some byproduct that sometimes can kind of change the nutrition of the ration and predispose them to that. It's pretty easily treated if it's recognized, and the recovery is amazing if you catch it early enough. So ideally, you give them an injection of thiamine, B1. You have to go to your vet to get that. If you don't have thiamine or easy access or quick access to a vet, you can use vitamin B complex, which is an over-the-counter, and that will work. I have used it. In more advanced cases, you may need to use steroids. Again, there could be swelling. That will require a veterinarian. Feed balanced rations with adequate fiber, avoid sudden changes in feed, feed more long stem forage. Again, things I've been saying over and over again. Rectal prolapse, well, why is this nutritionally related? It's nutritionally related because one of the many factors which predispose lambs to rectal prolapse is diet. It's not that often that you see lambs prolapse that are out grazing, even if their tail docks are real short. A lot of the research that's been done with short tail docking shows that the problem is when we have a short dock lamb and a high concentrate diet. Put those same lambs out on pasture and it's not likely a problem. We can treat that with a purse string suture. We can amputate that tissue with one of those rectal rings. Personal opinion, both of those are painful to the lamb, and the best thing to do is to salvage that lamb and take it to slaughter or put it in your freezer. Lots of things we do to prevent rectal prolapse, obviously longer tail docks, making sure the feed's not dusty, which could cause them to cough, prevent scouring. Anything that's going to make them strain is going to make them more likely to prolapse and get more forage in that diet. Scours, probably the most common thing kids are going to see in their lambs and kids, not a disease as much as a symptom. And scour simply means they're going more frequently and it's more liquid. It's often self-limiting, goes away without any treatment on its own. That's particularly true with probably older animals. Lots of different causes. We typically treat symptoms or treat it as a symptom. In severe cases, rehydration, they need fluids. Probiotics is definitely advocated for treating scours. It puts or restores healthy bacteria into the gut. There are various over-the-counter medications that is common to use, and they are sold for livestock. Both kaopectate and Pepto-Bismol are sold for livestock. Don't use Imodium AD because it paralyzes the gut, and we don't want to do that. If you know the cause of it, and ideally you would treat knowing the cause, it could be coccidious, so you would want to use the drugs I mentioned, and there could be a bacterial cause which could warrant a treatment with antimicrobials. You prevent scours with good sanitation, with good nutrition, avoid sudden changes in the diet, and that's feed or water. When I was a kid, there was this one county fair we went to. The water had a lot of chlorine in it. We started to bring our own water so they wouldn't scour. Already mentioned a coccidia stat in the feed. Urinary calculi, which is water belly, is the common name. It's the formation of kidney stones, calculi, in the urinary tract of the male, and it inhibits their ability to urinate. Wethers are most commonly affected, sometimes intact males, but not females. Again, most common with high grain, low roughage diets, and it definitely can be fatal. How you treat it depends on how far along the disease is and where the obstruction is located. It could be possible to clear the obstruction by drenching with ammonium chloride. It could be possible to snip off the end of the urethral process. If it's more advanced, if the obstruction is located further up, then it's going to require surgery by a veterinarian. Prognosis is not always good. And again, another option would simply be to salvage that animal. We prevent it by feeding a balanced ration, the proper ratio of calcium to phosphorus in the diet, at least 2 to 1, ammonium chloride in the ration, plenty of water consumption. So clean water, cool water in the summer, salt to encourage them to drink water. Change the water frequently, one of the most important things we can do, and roughage in the diet. White muscle disease, not that common with our show animals, more common when you're breeding them. It's like a muscular dystrophy. Stiffness or pain is the primary symptom. Of course, it's caused by a deficiency of selenium or vitamin E, which of course is what it's treated with. You do need a prescription to get the BOCI, which is the injectable product. We prevent it by feeding balanced diets. Selenium in the diet is preferred to giving injections, although there could be cases where a farm would need to give injections as well as the nutritional program. There are also oral supplements, but again, injections where they're necessary. Again, the common link in every one of these diseases practically is the lack of long stem forage in the diet and or poor feeding practices. All sheep and goats should have roughage forage in their diets. The fiber in concentrate feeds is not the same. It says, well, it's 15% fiber. That's not the same as what we call effective fiber. When we grind that roughage into smaller particles, we reduce that roughage effect. Sheep and goats should always have access to hay or other forage at all times. If we want to reduce the consumption of forage because we're worried about getting a hay belly, there's different things that can be done. We can feed less of a good quality forage. So a good quality feed is going to kind of go through them quicker. We can cut that forage back as we get closer to the show day, but it should be at least 10% of their diet. Again, not 10% crude fiber in their concentrate feed, but 10% of their diet, just kind of as a rule of thumb to throw out there. Poor feeding practices, I've already alluded to all of these. These need to be fed balanced rations. We don't want to unbalance the ration by adding something to a complete feed. So you're thinking, well, my lamb's growing too fast, so I'm going to slow him down, so I'm going to put oats in the ration. Well, the diet's already been balanced properly for calcium and phosphorus. You throw in oats, which is high in phosphorus, low in calcium, you're predisposing that animal to urinary calculi. Need to feed the same time each day. I think hand feeding, limit feeding is preferable to free choice, 2 to 3 times a day. Again, the same time each day. Remove any uneaten feed. Feed them what they'll clean up in 15 or 30 minutes, then remove those feeders. Avoid sudden changes in feed. I've already mentioned that. Make the feed changes gradually, 1/8 to a 1/4 pound change at a time. When we start lambs at the Research Center on feed, I usually do 1/4 pound changes for like several 3 or 4 days before I move to the next level. Avoid those accidental feed binges. Make sure your feed, where you're storing the feed is secure. Make sure your gates are secure. Keep your feeders cleaned regularly. Provide plenty of fresh, clean water. So that's kind of my take on the nutritional considerations for these show animals. And I know it kind of went through pretty fast. I always probably try to cover more than I should in a certain amount of time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. I appreciate that presentation. That had a lot of great tips for it. As we start into questions, I'm just going to go ahead and launch our poll so you can complete that for the Animal Care Wednesday webinars. You really alluded to the need to involve veterinarians in goat and kids care. Can you maybe help us understand how we can help our families who maybe are only raising those handful of animals for youth projects to understand the value of and need for this, as well as maybe increase the access to good ruminant animal veterinarian care? Because that's definitely a limiting factor.
And it's the veterinarian part is a challenge all over the country, and more of a challenge with people who have fewer animals. You know, a big farmer, especially, you look at a big dairy farmer, if they don't already have the, they have a vet, they can ask their vet to buy a bottle of penicillin or whatever. It's gonna be more challenging in the future when you're no longer going to be able to buy certain things over the counter. I think many of you are aware that antibiotics that we currently purchase over the counter are going to transition to veterinary prescription. So it's becoming more important than ever for everyone to have a veterinarian. And like I said, it's a challenge, but everybody, even if you just have 2 4-H lambs, you need to have a veterinarian so that you can perhaps obtain a medicine that you need, or perhaps simply to use it legally. And this is even harder for goats because very few products are approved for goats. One way to start, there's different ways to start. You can look to see and ask around whose veterinarian is both interested and knowledgeable about small ruminants. You could start with whatever vet you take your dogs and cats to, and because it's gonna be pretty important. And you can, all you young people that are, this is the longer term approach, but the young people that are in our animal science projects, boy, if we can encourage some of those kids to go to vet school and to pursue large animal veterinary medicine, that will be a big help. But it's definitely I'm going to say it's definitely a challenge, but we're going to have to meet that challenge, and hopefully the veterinary profession will meet us halfway. And I think there's going to be some efforts to try to bridge some of those gaps. But there are really good veterinarians out there. And even if the veterinarian's not an expert on small ruminants, that doesn't mean they can't be a good veterinarian for you, because they have training in the medicines, and they have training that we don't have, and you can work together.
Great. We've got a couple of questions coming in the chat here. So first question, Susan, are there different requirements for dairy goats versus meat animals to keep milk production up?
Yeah, there are absolutely different requirements for meat versus dairy, and even dairy hand milk versus parlor milk. So if you look, so when I say nutrient requirements, every so often the National Research Council, NRC, publishes nutrient requirements. And they were last published in 2002. And prior to that, they went back to 1985. And so they split them. In the case of sheep, they split out dairy sheep. In the case of goats, they actually split out fiber goats, Angoras, meat goats, Boer versus what they call indigenous breeds. I'm not exactly sure where the Kiko fits in, and dairy goats. And so, yes, there's different requirements for dairy. Even to grow out of weather is different. But certainly for a milk, an animal that's you want to not only produce more milk, but to lactate for a longer period of time. Yes, there are different requirements. Substantially higher nutrition for that dairy female, substantially higher. And just the dairy breeds in general, because they've been bred for dairy and not meat, like their maintenance requirements are higher. If I have a 150-pound boar and a 150-pound Sana, the Sana is going to have higher nutritional requirements than the boar.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Is there a public facing site on some of those nutritional differences you would recommend?
Unfortunately, well, it's a book, like $100 book, that actually has them in there. I've actually developed some spreadsheets I call them ration evaluators, so you can put the feeds that you have and put what you're feeding the animal and match it up to that particular animal. And so I have actually gleaned those nutritional requirements out of that book. And so they're in my spreadsheet. And then Iowa State has a program for both sheep and goats. It's called Brands. And that program is based on the latest nutritional requirements. A lot of other stuff you'll find on the internet is all based on a lot of the old stuff. Now, Langston University has what they call a nutrient calculator, which I'm trying to think, I can't remember whether they're based on the new or old requirements. And some people actually like the old requirements. And we'll use, if you recall the second or third slide I showed you, those were from the 1985 requirements, because the 2002 requirements, they don't give any nutritional requirements for a 2 to 4 month old lamb. An early weaned, high growth potential 2 to 4 week old lamb, 2 to 4 month old lamb. They're more range oriented, if you think about it. They're more traditionally oriented with feedlots and that sort of thing. Not true with goats. I mean, they have them for boar goats, but so there's the book, or there's finding somebody's fact sheet, spreadsheet, or software that has incorporated the new requirements. But like I said, my spreadsheets, if you go to sheepandgoat.com, you go into resourcing, you go under spreadsheets, you will find a ration evaluator for meat goats, dairy goats, meat goats, dairy goats, and sheep. And even from the old requirements for sheep. I don't think I did it for the old requirements for goats. And not that it matters to probably any of you, but I haven't finished the Angora goat one, because Angora goats are even less efficient. So a lot of nutrient requirements are based on the efficiency of the animal, what it's been bred for. Okay, that's enough. I talk too much.
No, thank you for the well-rounded answers. Those are valuable. The next question, it sounds like a piece of advice for 4-H families would be to ask the person they're buying from what they're currently feeding the lambs or kids. How would you manage that transition if you're feeding a particular commercial feed and you want to transition them to your preferred commercial feed? Or should you pay attention to composition of feed in addition to amount of feed?
So yes, you should definitely, whoever you buy the lambs or kids from, you should find out what they're feeding. A lot of times when I sell animals, breeding stock, ewe lambs or ram lambs, I'll give them some feed. So to help transition them, and I would think that whoever's selling the lambs or kids to youth should be willing to do that. And then you would transition them in a similar, you would, you'd start with the first, you start with their feed, and then you'd start changing it over a little at a time. Again, that quarter pound. Because the other transition could be, there could be a forage component as well. So that's a change, so you're changing the brand of grain feed, but you may also be needing to do a transition that involves the forage. So I would find out what they're feeding, get feed from them, and then make that, again, there's no danger in a slow transition. There's danger in doing something too fast, but there's really never danger in doing it too slow, giving them time to adjust. And as far as the composition of the feed versus the amount of feed, it's the amount that the animals need. That their nutrient requirements have nothing to do with percentages. Their nutrient, well, I shouldn't say totally, but generally speaking, they need so many pounds of energy. They need so many pounds or grams of protein. They need so many grams or ounces or international units of vitamins and minerals. Okay, that's what they need. We use the percentages to help us balance the rations. And we use the percentages sometimes to make sure we're not creating a problem. And so many of the nutrient requirements are based on, you're assuming the animal is eating 3 pounds. I'm just saying as an example. And so when you look at the percentages, if you switched it to 2 pounds, you can see how it's all going to change. So rations are balanced on the amount. We use the percentages as to help us figure it out. I hope that makes sense. Because like I said, if you were feeding an animal a pound of feed, and it needed a tenth of a pound of protein, so that's 10%. You cut what you're feeding them in half, and then that protein requirements increase. That's why we tell people that have like breeding sheep or breeding goats, if you're not meeting the energy needs of those females, then their protein requirements are much higher as a percentage, because you've reduced their intake of feed. And we often play around with the intake on market lambs and kids, right? Because they're growing too fast, they're not growing enough. So we change what we give them. Again, that's where things like oats and fat come in. They're to change it out without changing intake, because animals still need to be full. They still need to be 10, or at least they do to me from a welfare standpoint. So I answer questions sometimes too long. I'm sorry.
Kind of a follow-up here on that one. If you had them, could you pop those calculator links or different ways of those lists of those requirements in the chat, or provide them to me email? I can send them out
Yeah, like
at
I
a
said,
later date.
it's simply going to sheepandgoat.com and going under resources and spreadsheets. But I'd be happy to send that, because each spreadsheet doesn't have a link. It's just the spread. It's actually I can tell you, it's sheep and goat .com/ now I can't remember. I think there's an S on it. It should just be that. And like I said, they're ration evaluators. So you would put in, like if you were buying a commercial feed, you'd need to put the nutrient composition of that feed in there. If you're feeding a forage, you need to put the nutrient composition of that feed in there. And you'd like it to be accurate, but sometimes you have to guess, and that's understandable. And then you go find the animals that you're feeding, and then you match it up and see if you're meeting. It's kind of a trial and error thing. It's free because of spreadsheet. The Iowa State program is actually a paid program, and if you, as educators, if you do much ration balancing, they give you a special deal. So and it's called Brands, and it's Iowa State, and they have those sheep and goats. And that's really only and then Langston. Then there's a couple of free programs out there as well, a couple more on the internet. I actually have an article, a page on all these ways to balance rations, because I'm a big advocate for that. People say, am I feeding them? They'll send me an email, am I feeding them right? Well, it's not an opinion, it's kind of math and science.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Shifting a little bit here on vaccinations, what's your opinion on vaccination programs with show animals traveling around to new areas and potential new sicknesses being exposed to versus the animals primarily staying at home or maybe only doing one show?
Well, we all have to appreciate that showing is a large biosecurity risk. And so I'm not certain vaccinations to a certain degree can solve it. I mean, obviously the clostridial diseases, we should take care of those. Traveling to different shows, you start to think, what are the risks of those? Sore mouth is probably the primary risk of showing. And of course, there is a vaccine for sore mouth. And so if you're breeding your animals, you may, if you bring sore mouth home, you may find a need to instigate a sore mouth vaccination program. And then once you have sore mouth on your farm, if you are showing your own lambs and kids, again, you might want to vaccinate for sore mouth so you don't have it when you don't want it. All the sore mouth vaccine does is give them sore mouth when you want them to have it and where. So instead of getting it all over their face, which may affect their health and productivity, you give it, in the case of a sheep, you usually give it in the flank underneath. Goats, we experimented with different places to give the goat vaccine. We were giving it on the tail head, and then we switched to the ear. And we found that the vaccine, it didn't seem to do much, but yet it did, because we didn't have any significant sore mouth outbreaks. We used to do a buck test. For 11 years, we did a meat goat performance test with bucks from all over the country, and sore mouth, they came in with sore mouth. So showing is not that different than a buck test. I mean, you're exposing your animals to whatever comes to the county fair or whatever comes to whatever festival or wherever you're going. So I think what's more important than, other than, like I said, maybe a vaccine for sore mouth, is making sure that you isolate them when they come home. Bringing home your show stock is no different than you going out and buying animals and bringing them in. So keep them separate for 30 days, away from all the rest of the animals, no fence line contact, no nose to nose contact, feed and water them last. So treat them as a new introduction to your farm. Sometimes they come home with some other problems, but I'm not sure vaccination can address that. Again, I think sore mouth, pink eye would be another one that you could pick up at the fair. Foot rot's not highly likely, but I suppose possibly. But I'm not so sure vaccination can solve the biosecurity issue you're showing. Just understand the risk. There's nothing wrong with showing, it's wonderful, but just understand that they are jeopardizing the rest of the animals, so treat them accordingly when they come home. More shows you go to, more risk.
Great, thank you. The next question, you talked about back fat being more of a detriment of finish than weight. How would you suggest a 4-H member gain experience in how to assess finish?
So yeah, we tend to market lambs and even maybe target them for shows based on weight, but it's really finish, how much fat they have. Commercial industry, between 1,500 and 2,500 inch of back fat is about what we aim for. And there's only two ways to actually learn how to do that for real. One is, a couple ways. I don't know if any of your fairs have carcass contests. They're the very best thing there is. And I know some states, even some counties, all the lambs, I think it's in Virginia, all the lambs in the market lamb show are slaughtered. And it's a separate contest, which I disagree with. I think they shouldn't be separate. But somebody could win the grand champion lamb and not win the carcass contest. But kids all get data back on them. So you could have some experience with a carcass contest, particularly a smaller one where all the kids would handle those lambs and then they'd get the carcass data back on them. And in an ideal situation, they'd also visit the slaughterhouse. So that would be one way. And of course, logistically, that's not always easy because we're talking about killing the lamb, which, you know, until it's the end of that lamb's or kid's show career, you know, that's not real practical. The other way would be scanning, an ultrasound scanning. Scanning is accurate, most accurate when you're comparing one lamb to another, not necessarily the actual back fat, but that would be a way to do them without killing those lambs. Otherwise, we're guessing until we actually see the lambs, the slaughter lambs, or see the carcass data. We're guessing, and people learn to be really good at it. They really do. But at some point, they need to have seen lambs killed. If a judge, I hope I'm not picking on anybody out there, if a judge has never done meat judging, he's never gone to the slaughterhouse, he or she has never judged a carcass contest, I'm going to question how good a judge he really is. Because ultimately, we are not producing secretariat. I might be dating myself there. We're not producing a horse or a racehorse. We are producing a carcass. And so some sort of program where the kids could go to slaughterhouses after handling lambs, some sort of, or a scanning would be the best way to learn. And because all breeds are different, and then there's as much variability within a breed as outside of the breed. There's a really good chart that tells you what the ideal weight of a market lamb should be based on the size of the sire and dam breed. It's a really good tool for, you know, you could say, well, I raise, you just pick your breed, and whatever the mature weight of those breeds are, and you crossed them, that would tell you what the ideal weight of that. And if it's purebred and they're both 180-pound ewes, then you could see what the ideal weight for that is. That's a pretty useful chart. I'd be happy to share that if I could find it. But you need to do some meats and carcass work. That's what you need to do. We need to turn our kids on to that more.
Great. Shifting back a little bit on nutrition and diets, do you think when feeding peas or corn, do they need to be cracked for best nutrient intake, or as whole fine?
I'm a really big advocate for feeding whole grain. And the reason is they have to do their own grinding, so that's good for the rumen. If you're limit feeding or hand feeding, you know, where they're going to clean everything up, then you're not going to have a problem with them sorting. So if I mix corn with a protein pellet, or I mix barley with soybean meal and vitamins and minerals, they're going to clean it all up, so I'm not concerned about sorting. If I'm concerned about sorting, so let's say I was free choicing it, then I might be concerned about feeding that whole grain as opposed to a pellet. In terms of cracking it, the only time nutritionally you need to crack it would be for that pre-ruminant. So that baby lamb, that baby goat, before his rumen is fully functioning, the creep feed, that early feed, is going to be beneficial if it's processed. It's got a small particle size. When we crack, grind, roll, do whatever we do to grains after that age of the lamb or kid, we primarily do it so it mixes better, because there's no nutritional advantage. And years ago, Virginia Tech did a lot of work looking at lamb rations, and they found the most efficient ration was a whole grain with a protein pellet. And they didn't even feed forage, but I'm not always sure. I'm an advocate for not always including some forage in the diet. And cracking costs money. Why pay for something they don't need? So again, hand feed or limit feed, I think it works well. If you put animals on full feed, which I don't think the 4-H kids should do, but a commercial producer might cut down on labor, then you might have. So you can imagine if male lambs, all they did was eat mostly the corn, and they didn't get the protein pellet or the mineral mix in there, and you didn't have forage for them, you're really asking for urinary calculus.
Great. Thank you for addressing that. Kind of a last question to wrap us up here. How can we assist our families to evaluate the resources that they have at home or limitations their child might have in a feeding program to provide that best care to a lamb or a kid? Like you said, it is dependent on the person providing the care. And even though a lamb might have the same genetic potential, it's still going to be dependent on what you can do or not do.
Well, I like to think, and I like to think that the people they buy the project animals from can help them. And, you know, that's one way, is that they can help them. Now, if you buy your lamb from too far away, you know, other than email help, but I think first time kids at the beginning of their projects, they need mentors. And those mentors can be the people that sold them the lambs or kids, or they can be the older 4-Hers and the more experienced ones. I really think they need mentors. I also think that for the most part, kids shouldn't be balancing their own rations. They should buy the commercial pelleted feeds or textured feeds. Whether they want to go with a standard ration that anyone might feed, or whether they want to go with the higher price show feeds, you know, that's up to them. But I think, and then, you know, always making sure there's some of that forage in the diet. I think that those are some of the things that can really help kids get started. After that, it's teaching those good habits of, you know, clean feeders, clean waterers, clean pens, you know, feeding the same time every day, and frequently weighing the lambs and feeling them. And I know feeling them for finish, I think that's really hard. I really do. It took me a long time to get good at it. And I'd say I haven't done any well, yeah, I have. We've continued to do carcass work throughout my career, but you know, that's one of the hard things. A kid can understand, well, my lamb weighs 80 pounds and I want to get him to over 100, but it's going to be hard to, the finish part is harder for them to learn. And that's where they need to rely on the other mentors. Whether that's extension or, you know, I mentioned some of these show feeds. I know in our state, and sometimes those companies, those representatives taking some of the role that extension used to have. I don't like it as much. Wish extension was always providing that, but it's just not always the case. And so there are people out there that really want to help. And sometimes the challenge can be making sure their motivations are proper. And you know, I don't have any children, but if I had kids, it would be hard for me, because I would be torn between doing what's right and what's best for the lamb and what's best for the sheep industry, versus some of the things that I read that I find very distasteful about the projects. And I would be hard for me. So find a good mentor, ones that are ethical, honorable, and want to help your kids in the early stages. Eventually, they'll become the mentee. They'll become the mentors eventually.
Great. Thank you for those words of wisdom, Susan. We appreciate it. Well, that takes up today and the topic. I don't see any new questions coming in. I popped the YouTube channel link for our Animal Care Wednesday webinars, where you'll find the recording of today's as well as our archived ones. And as far as coming into 2021, keep your emails tuned up for our updates as we get our planning underway for 2021 webinars. So if you have any ideas or ways that you want to cover a topic, feel free to reach out to me directly via email, and we'll consider those. And yes, thank you again. We'll echo that congrats on retirement, Susan, and thank you so much for your expertise. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.